We've already been seeing a little bit about what this eclipse is up to since about the time that Mars conjoined with the South Node, but there's of course more to come. So I want to explore what the nature of this eclipse in Libra is going to look like. And we're actually going to use a traditional text to do it. We are going to be using a source from Ptolemy to go through this. So I'm going to share my screen so that you can see everything that we're talking about in real time. And then we can go through this. Ptolemy has just this really great bulleted list of things to consider when you're thinking about the kind of beings affected by an eclipse. And there's also something I'm going to go through when we talk about how long do the effects of an eclipse last. I am drawing from the book Astrology of the World. This is translated by Benjamin Dykes. It is Astrology of the World 1, the Ptolemaic Inheritance. It covers weather, prices and commodities, eclipses and comets, and chorography. So it's a really amazing book. There's a ton of awesome things in here, and we will dip into it just a little bit for today's experience with this. So as you can see on the screen, we are seeing that the moon is conjunct the sun in Libra. Now, normally we're like, oh, hey, that's a new moon. Cool. Mercury's a bit nearby. But the other thing that's a bit nearby is the South Node. So when the South Node is roughly 15 degrees near the lunation, which would be a full moon or a new moon, in this case, a new moon, this provides an eclipse. This makes the circumstances for an eclipse possible. This shows that the sun and the moon are not only conjunct each other, but they are at the right declination to block each other out. So that is what is happening with this particular new moon in Libra, which is our first solar eclipse in Libra and our first of the eclipses that will be occurring in Libra over the next 1.5 to 2 years. So we already had our first eclipse in Aries. If you recall, back in March, we had 2 Mars-ruled eclipses. One was in Scorpio, and then the other was in Aries. Now we are going to have 2 Venus-ruled eclipses, one being in Libra, and then we have our final lunar eclipse happening in Taurus at the end of the month. So these 2 weeks of October are eclipse season. This is what we're talking about. From the 14th of October to really, let's just say the 29th of October, that's the specific eclipse season. And this eclipse, the annular solar eclipse, which will provide a ring of fire to those lucky enough to see it, including my own parents, will be occurring on October 14th. And if you're in Eastern time, it's going to be around 1:55 p.m. So definitely a time of day where it can be viewed. And so what we see is that America is able to view it. And so those of us who live in the United States or in places where the visibility will be, that is, in some interpretations, really showing the areas of the world that are also going to be impacted. There are other ways that show this, and those are things that we would dive deeper into in a personal session or something like that. But we can pretty much understand that the US will probably feel some effects from this eclipse. And now we can dive in to the interpretation of the eclipse and the nature of it. So first thing we're going to look for, and even according to Ptolemy, when we think about the kind of beings affected by an eclipse, for reference, I'm looking at page 335 in the book that I'm looking at. And so the first thing we look at, and this is probably going to sound pretty familiar, it's pretty much procedural, is the sign of the eclipse itself. Where is the eclipse happening? And of course, we have it happening in Libra. So the moon is conjunct the sun. Mercury is gaining as well and is officially under the beams at this point. So if you look towards the eclipse, Mercury will also be there. If you're looking towards the eclipse, I'm not saying don't, I'm saying have those glasses, because this could be very damaging from your eyes. So we all know, don't look directly at an eclipse. Don't look directly at the sun ever, unless you have special glasses or some kind of other imaging thing that keeps your eyes safe. Always have to say it. Always will. So we have this solar eclipse in Libra. Libran themes are the things that will come to mind. We think about the scales, we think about balance, we think about Venus. And that, of course, is the next step of the we're doing here, the nature of the ruling planets over the sign of the eclipse and the pivot before it. So the ruling planets here is Venus. So we can see 2 things that are noticeable here when we think about the nature and the condition of planets involved in this. The moon is doing fine. I mean, it's a new moon, so it's conjunct the sun, which is not its favorite thing. Definitely wouldn't be doing magic for this. I say that all the time. We don't do eclipse magic typically anyway, but the sun is also in the sign that is opposite the sun's exaltation. So that means the sun is in fall. So the sun is not feeling at the sun's best. The sun is not in an area where everybody knows their name. The sun is kind of out in unfamiliar territory and doesn't have a whole lot to go by when we think about the condition. And so the sun might look to its dispositor or the ruler of its sign for a little bit of help here. Now, up until a couple weeks or a week or so ago, Venus was in Leo. So they had this mutual reception. So it was like, hey, Venus, I'm at your house, you're at my house. Can you look at my stuff for me and give me this information on what I should do? Venus has now left Leo and is in Virgo. So Virgo is the opposite sign from Venus's exaltation, which means she is also in fall. So these two are not doing really, they're not thriving right now. I think that's a good way to put it. So when we think about the sun looking to Venus for support, and Venus doesn't really have as much support to give because her cup's a bit empty right now as well, we think that the leadership that is represented by a solar eclipse may also not really have its structure as much as it would like. So we think about the differences in our government, the differences in our leadership, in the rulership of certain things, specifically as a nation for this, because it is a solar eclipse and we're thinking about how is this going to affect our country, our nation. And I'm speaking as someone who lives in the United States, but also knowing that the United States is going to be perceiving this directly. So we'll look at that. That's not to say the rest of the world's not going to see effects. And please comment if you notice any headlines where you are that really seem to go along with this. I would love to be further educated. In this case, we see, and it kind of feels to me like a sort of, I mentioned like a cake in a baking competition that loses its structure and you have to throw it in the blast chiller to make it like really bring itself back together. In this case, it does feel like there's something that is losing its structure. And of course, we do know that currently in the United States, there is no Speaker of the House. So there is a little bit of discord or lack of structure happening. And if we're thinking about the pivot before, we can also think about the ascending sign here, which is ruled by Saturn. Saturn is retrograde. Saturn's in Pisces, again, with a bit of a lack of structure. So thinking about these kinds of things and just how it's saying that our structures are a bit wibbly wobbly right now. So thinking about how that is going to be affected, likely with something noticeable perhaps in the headlines around this day. Again, when Mars interacted with the South Node on October 3rd-ish, that is when we noticed that the Speaker of the House was removed. It was right around that day. And there are texts, even though I can't find my exact page, that mention that when Mars interacts with the South Node, it does sort of bring up the themes of the solar eclipse there and reminds us of that and catalyzes it a bit. So we're seeing that Mars kind of perhaps gave us a preview of what's going on with this eclipse. So we are redistributing influence in some ways, and you might notice that in your personal life as well. The major thing that we're thinking about here as a solar eclipse is the king or the head of state or head of governance. So we'll want to be looking at leadership roles during this time. And then in 2 weeks, which will be on October 28th. And I'm scrolling down here because if I go down here, I actually can just click right to it. On the lunar eclipse, we'll see effects for the people, the body of a country, which is its people. So we're noticing now we're focusing on what's going on with the leadership. And in 2 weeks, we'll focus on what's going on with the people. And I will, of course, do a video for that as well. So we already talked about the sign of the ruling planets, which is the next step. We talked about Venus being in Virgo. And she is receiving a trine from Jupiter. So there is a bit of a whole sign trine, even though Jupiter could be doing a little bit better too, since he's in retrograde as well. Sign of the ruling planets, and then the constellation of fixed stars ruling over the sign of the eclipse and its preceding angle. So we talked about the preceding angle, and we talked about the sign of Libra. The constellation of fixed stars is Libra. So we're looking at this and saying, okay, justice is something that we're thinking about in this. Governance is something we're thinking about in this. Perhaps equity and fairness becoming a theme, and the power of influence. Perhaps my own instinct is that the power of influence moves from the heads of the organization more into the hands of the people who run it. My instinct on that, of course, comes from the fact that these are both in fall. So we're seeing that the influence is not going to the head of state or the person in charge. The influence is more of the people who tell that person what they need or what's going on. And also we have Mercury right here, kind of saying that there are potentials for discussions, potentials for mitigations, potentials for compromises, potentials for even misunderstandings, perhaps, or, debates. And I think we can think of Mars culminating here right near the MC as maybe bringing that into sort of a heated debate as well. So these are things that I'm looking at here and thinking about, and I will see what the headlines say as far as bringing it into actual reality. As far as what you can be doing during this eclipse, don't do any magic. Don't do any intentional stuff. This is a time to observe. This is a time to let the stage be set around you. So you as the actor know what materials and what props you are working with as you move forward. Let the universe conspire in your favor and set itself up in its best equilibrium so that you can then move forward aligned with that. And so one of the things that I'm kind of is the interpretation of this is witnessing the evolution of a power structure. And the affirmation is, I'm ready to understand my role in the situation. That's what I'm going to be focusing on. I'm ready to understand where my influence and my power is most effective and helpful. So 2 options for you there. And if you're looking for something to do, again, pay attention to how you're feeling about any events or revelations that do come up for you or do come up for us as a nation. The way you feel is going to be your guide into actions that you may have the ability to take and areas that you might have the power of influence in. So I hope that this all was clear. I hope it was fun kind of going into a little bit of our traditional astrology texts for a bit. If you enjoy that, we do have a source book club in Patreon that I absolutely adore. And so you can go there, and we're actually currently reading Cosmos and Psyche by Richard Tarnas, which is a really fun exploration of the evolution of society and the patterns of society and the cycles of society and how the outer planet cycles really do help along with that. So it's really amazing to read. It's a pretty fun read. There's audiobook versions available as well, and we discuss it each week in the Patreon. So if that's something you're excited about, fantastic. Another thing that I can actually bring up on this is we have launched Japan. So Emily and I are taking a group of people on a ancient wisdom retreat to Japan end of next summer. So there's plenty of time to be planning for it. And that trip has launched. So you can go to the link in the places where the links are, and you can find information there as well. So I hope that this was a good video. I hope you feel empowered by what is coming and by your ability to respond with power to everything around you. And I'll look forward to seeing how this unfolds as well. Remember, let me know if you see something that you think corresponds with the eclipse, and we can kind of geek out about it and be in awe of it together, depending on the nature of it. Have a safe and wonderful eclipse, everybody.